What would you do if a queen, surrounded by luxury, status, and centuries of tradition, was suddenly caught in the middle of a scandal so explosive it threatened to bring down her entire reputation overnight? Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss the latest royal scandals, hidden truths, and untold stories that the palace doesn't want you to know. Because what we're about to uncover is not just another tabloid rumour, it's a revelation that could change how history remembers the woman who once fought for her place in the monarchy, only to find herself fleeing the country in disgrace. At the centre of it all is a shocking discovery made at her private home, an accusation that sent shockwaves through the royal household, and a dramatic escape aboard a private jet. This is the story of how suspicion, betrayal, and the ghost of the past collided to force a queen to leave everything behind. It all began quietly, almost too quietly, within the walls of Raymil House, Camilla's countryside estate. For years, this home was portrayed as her sanctuary, a place away from the cameras, the press, and the stiff formality of palace life. But that image shattered when one of her own servants stumbled upon something no one expected to see outside the heavily guarded royal archives. A missing heirloom, once belonging to Queen Elizabeth II. At first, the servant thought it might have been a clever replica, or perhaps some kind of misplaced family trinket, but closer inspection revealed the unmistakable craftsmanship, the crest, and the history attached to the piece. It was no simple ornament. It was a relic tied to the late queen herself, an object believed to be secured, catalogued, and untouchable. And yet here it was, resting quietly in Camilla's private estate. The news spread quickly, not through the press at first, but within the inner circle of the royal household. Whispers moved faster than lightning. How did it get there? And why wasn't it accounted for? Every possibility raised darker questions. If it had been misplaced, why was it found in a private residence rather than returned? If it had been gifted, why wasn't it officially recorded? And if it had been taken, well, that implication alone was enough to ignite fury in those who had already harboured doubts about Camilla's place within the royal family. One of the first to confront her about the discovery was Princess Anne, whose long-standing rivalry with Camilla stretched back decades. The heirloom was merely the spark. The true fire came from years of resentment, slights, and unresolved history. Anne, known for her bluntness and unwillingness to mince words, is said to have confronted Camilla directly, accusing her of theft and declaring outright that she would never be a true queen. That phrase cut deeper than any accusation. It wasn't just about the heirloom anymore. It was about legitimacy, acceptance, and whether Camilla's crown was ever truly earned. For Anne, this wasn't just about one missing item. It was about everything Camilla had come to symbolise. An interloper, a usurper, someone who gained by taking from others. Those who witnessed the clash described it as brutal and deeply personal. Camilla, who had worked for decades to rehabilitate her public image, stood accused in a way that tied her to the very worst narratives about her life. Anne's words echoed the judgments of countless members of the public who had never forgiven her past, who had never accepted her rise, and who saw in this scandal confirmation of their darkest suspicions. The heirloom became more than an object. It became proof, in the minds of many, of a reputation that had haunted Camilla since the earliest days of her relationship with Charles. The aftermath was swift. The royal household could not ignore what had been found at Raymil House. A secret meeting was called, bringing together family members and senior aides to decide how to handle the fallout. The decision was made to conduct a discreet but thorough search of Camilla's estate to ensure no other heirlooms had been misplaced, hidden, or mishandled. When no other items were discovered, some within the circle argued that the situation might have been a misunderstanding. But the seed of suspicion had already been planted, and once planted, it grew like a vine strangling the family's unity. Whispers outside the palace grew louder. Stories began circulating about Camilla's reputation, not just as a controversial figure in the monarchy, but as someone who always seemed to take. The public remembered how she was painted in the press, as the woman who took what wasn't hers. First a relationship, then a title, and now, allegedly, an heirloom of great value. Even though no public charges were made, and no official statement addressed the matter directly, perception was already set. In scandals like these, it doesn't take proof to cause damage, it only takes doubt. For Camilla, the weight of the accusations was unbearable. This wasn't just another whisper about her past. This was a direct attack on her honour as a queen. To be accused by Anne, to be judged in the shadow of Elizabeth, and to see the cracks forming in the very foundation she had spent years trying to build. This was more than a scandal. It was a reckoning. The whispers of Diana's legacy, the bitterness of Anne's rivalry, and the unyielding glare of public judgment all came crashing down at once. And so, as pressure mounted and the atmosphere inside the royal circle turned icy, Camilla made her choice. Rather than stay and face the storm head-on, she boarded her private jet and left the country. To the outside world, the move looked less like a retreat and more like an escape. She didn't leave with pomp or ceremony. She slipped away quietly, but unmistakably, and the symbolism was impossible to ignore. A queen caught fleeing, not ruling, her departure left Charles isolated, weakened, and perhaps more vulnerable than ever before. It gave Anne's words a sting of truth, as though Camilla herself had validated the accusations by choosing flight over defence. For the public, the scandal at Raymil House and the dramatic escape that followed reopened wounds that were never fully healed. People asked themselves, had Camilla ever truly deserved the crown? Or was this the inevitable collapse of an image that was never more than carefully managed illusion? In the end, the heirloom itself almost didn't matter. What mattered was what it represented. The idea that history, legacy, and loyalty could be betrayed behind closed doors. And that the woman who once fought so hard to stand beside a king may have just lost everything in the eyes of a nation.
The fallout from what happened at Raymil House did not stay contained within the estate's walls. The discovery of the heirloom and Camilla's abrupt departure triggered a ripple effect that spread across the royal household, shaking the very foundations of the monarchy's fragile unity. At the heart of this chaos was a decades-long rivalry that resurfaced with a vengeance, reignited by Princess Anne's blistering confrontation. For those who had watched the two women move through the royal stage for years, it was clear this was not just a clash over one missing relic. It was the culmination of a feud that had been simmering beneath the surface since the earliest days of their connection. Anne and Camilla's rivalry stretches back to their youth, to a time when Andrew Parker Bowles stood as a pivotal figure in both of their lives. Anne was romantically linked to Andrew before his marriage to Camilla, and while their relationship never evolved into something permanent, it was enough to spark a sense of tension that never quite faded. When Camilla went on to marry him, whispers began that Anne had always seen her as someone willing to step into spaces that weren't hers to claim. Years later, when Charles's affair with Camilla came to light, Anne's disapproval only grew sharper, reinforced by a sense of betrayal not only against her brother but against the values she believed the family was meant to uphold. For Anne, Camilla represented disruption, instability, and above all, intrusion. The heirloom discovery provided Anne the perfect opportunity to voice what she had held back for years. Her accusation of theft wasn't just about the object, it was about history repeating itself. It was about Camilla always seeming to cross lines others respected. When Anne declared she would never be a true queen, the words were barbed with decades of resentment, a declaration meant not only for Camilla but for anyone who dared defend her. It wasn't just a personal insult, it was a public branding, the kind of judgment that could never be erased. Observers of the royal family noted how this conflict seemed to echo the much larger story of Camilla's struggle for acceptance. From the moment her relationship with Charles became public, Camilla faced an uphill battle to reshape her image. For years, she had been vilified in the press, cast as the other woman who had contributed to the heartbreak of Diana. Diana's own famous words, "There were three of us in this marriage," cemented a narrative that has haunted Camilla for decades. Even as time passed and she took on charitable roles, appearing in carefully curated public events to soften her image, there were always those who could not separate her from the pain of the past. The scandal at Raymil House seemed to confirm what skeptics had always believed, that Camilla's rise to the throne was built not on grace or honor, but on taking what others had left behind. Relationships, titles, and now, allegedly, heirlooms. Each layer of her life appeared, at least in the eyes of her critics, to be marked by acquisition rather than inheritance. The perception was brutal, but perception in matters of royalty is everything. In a family where every move is scrutinized, every gesture analyzed, Camilla's sudden flight only deepened the image of someone unwilling to stand and defend her place. For Anne, this was not just about tearing Camilla down, it was about preserving her mother's legacy. Anne had been one of the staunchest defenders of Elizabeth's wishes and values, and she had always bristled at the way Camilla's role had been elevated after Elizabeth's passing. When Charles made the controversial decision to shift Camilla's title from Queen Consort to simply Queen, it struck Anne as a violation of what their mother would have wanted. The discovery of the heirloom, tied so directly to Elizabeth, seemed almost symbolic, a physical reminder that Camilla had stepped into territory she had no right to claim. In Anne's eyes, it wasn't just theft of an object, it was theft of legacy itself. Inside the family, the tension grew unbearable. Those who once tried to maintain neutrality now found themselves forced to pick a side. Some argued for compassion, suggesting the heirloom might have been misplaced and Camilla unfairly targeted. Others, however, whispered that this was proof of everything they had always suspected. The divide widened, and Camilla's absence only amplified the uncertainty. If she had nothing to hide, critics asked, why flee? If she had been misunderstood, why not stay and clear her name? Silence, in the face of accusation, spoke louder than any words she might have offered. Meanwhile, the public was relentless. Headlines painted her escape as an act of desperation, and social media buzzed with comparisons to past scandals that had haunted the monarchy. Old footage of Diana resurfaced. Clips of her honesty and vulnerability contrasted sharply against Camilla's silence and retreat. The narrative was clear. Where Diana had stood before the cameras and won hearts through her candor, Camilla had chosen secrecy and flight, reinforcing the idea that she was unfit to carry the crown. For Charles, the situation was devastating. While he remained in place, his queen's absence left him politically and emotionally exposed. Every photograph of him alone seemed to carry unspoken questions. Could he maintain strength without her, or was her departure the beginning of a larger unraveling? Those close to him spoke of a man torn between love and duty, but the public saw only weakness, a king abandoned in his moment of need. At its core, the Raymil House scandal was not just about an object, but about everything that object represented: trust, legitimacy, and belonging. For Anne, it was a moment of vindication, a chance to expose what she believed to be the truth. For Camilla, it was a collapse of decades of carefully constructed image management. And for the monarchy itself, it was yet another fracture in an institution already struggling to define its place in the modern world. In the end, the feud between Anne and Camilla ensured that this was not just another passing controversy. It was a war of words, legacies, and reputations, one that forced the entire royal household to question not only who deserved the crown, but who had the right to call themselves a true queen. The drama surrounding Camilla's departure didn't just end with her sudden flight. It marked the beginning of a storm that shook the monarchy from the inside out. Once the news broke that she had boarded a private jet and left the country, speculation reached a fever pitch. Was this a temporary retreat, or had she abandoned her role altogether? To many observers, the optics were damning. A queen leaving her own kingdom under the shadow of suspicion felt less like a pause for reflection and more like an admission of guilt. The scandal at Raymil House had been shocking enough, but Camilla's choice to flee transformed it into something much larger, a public crisis of legitimacy. For decades, Camilla had worked tirelessly to rehabilitate her image. The early years were disastrous for her public reputation. In the wake of Diana's heartbreak, Camilla was cast as the villain in a story of betrayal. The infamous tapes, the tabloid headlines, and Diana's own heartbreaking honesty cemented Camilla's role as the outsider who had disrupted a fairy tale marriage. No amount of quiet living, country weekends, or low-profile appearances could undo that overnight. She became, in the eyes of many, a symbol of what had been lost. But slowly, carefully, a strategy began to take shape. Through charity work, consistent appearances alongside Charles, and the palace's relentless effort to reshape the narrative, Camilla's image softened. She was repositioned as a steadying influence, someone who avoided drama and focused on causes she cared about. By the time of her coronation, her transformation seemed nearly complete. She was no longer the despised other woman of the 1990s, but a queen consort who had earned, at least on the surface, a measure of respect. The palace had managed what once seemed impossible: the rehabilitation of Camilla Parker Bowles. That's why her abrupt flight was so devastating. It undid decades of work in a single moment. To her critics, it was confirmation of what they had always believed, that her position was built on illusion, and when tested, the illusion collapsed. To her defenders, it was a painful step backward, a loss of the progress she had made. But regardless of where one stood, the optics could not be denied. A queen who had fled her own country because of a scandal linked to her late mother-in-law's legacy. The symbolism was powerful and impossible to ignore. Queen Elizabeth II had embodied duty and perseverance, standing firm in the face of every crisis. Diana had embodied vulnerability and honesty, willing to speak openly about her pain. Camilla, by contrast, was now associated with silence and retreat. And in a monarchy that thrives on symbolism, that contrast was devastating. Inside the royal family, the implications were equally damaging. Camilla's departure created a vacuum that others quickly filled. Princess Anne, long considered one of the hardest-working members of the family, emerged stronger than ever. Her vocal opposition to Camilla's elevation from queen consort to simply queen was suddenly vindicated. What once seemed like stubbornness or bitterness now looked prophetic. Anne's insistence that Camilla would never truly be queen echoed louder than ever, amplified by Camilla's own absence. Even within the palace, loyalties shifted. Aides and insiders who had once carefully supported Camilla's rise now found themselves re-evaluating. Without her present to defend herself, the narrative was rewritten in real time. Some described her as fragile, unable to withstand the pressures of her role. Others suggested she had always been opportunistic, and the heirloom scandal was simply proof of that. In either case, the respect she had fought to earn seemed to evaporate almost instantly. The public, meanwhile, grew restless. Opinion polls reflected growing doubt about her suitability, and online commentary became merciless. Old scandals were dragged back into the light, with headlines juxtaposing Diana's legacy against Camilla's current disgrace. For younger generations, who had grown up with Diana as an icon and Camilla as the interloper, the scandal seemed to confirm what their parents had always said, that history had never truly forgiven her. Raymil House itself became a symbol of the controversy. Once a private refuge, it was now synonymous with secrecy and suspicion. The fact that the heirloom was discovered there cast a shadow not only on Camilla but on the very idea of private royal estates. What else could be hidden behind closed doors? The narrative was no longer about a single object but about trust, transparency, and the uneasy balance between personal life and public duty. What made the situation even more complicated was the weight of Elizabeth's legacy. The late Queen was still revered, and anything tied to her name carried immense emotional weight. To discover that an object linked to her had surfaced in Camilla's home was not just an issue of property, it was an emotional betrayal. It touched on the deep reverence many people felt for Elizabeth, who had dedicated her entire life to service. The contrast between Elizabeth's lifelong duty and Camilla's sudden disappearance was stark and painful. For Charles, the scandal was a nightmare with no easy resolution. He had spent much of his reign so far trying to balance tradition with modernization, continuity with change. His marriage to Camilla had been both a personal victory and a public challenge. But with her gone, he faced a kingdom full of questions. Could he remain strong without her? Was her absence a temporary retreat or the beginning of something permanent? And most troubling of all, would her downfall also tarnish his reign? The scandal reopened old wounds that many had tried to forget. Diana's story, long treated as a tragic chapter of the past, suddenly felt alive again. People remembered the pain, the betrayal, and the sacrifices. They compared Diana's suffering to Camilla's scandal and found the latter wanting. Where Diana had been wronged, Camilla was now accused of wrongdoing. The parallels were impossible to ignore, and they tilted public opinion even further against Camilla. In the end, her flight was not just about one heirloom or one confrontation. It was about everything she had carried with her into the monarchy: the past affairs, the rivalries, the controversies, and the painstakingly rebuilt image. The heirloom scandal simply ripped away the facade, leaving behind the raw truth of a queen who, when faced with the weight of legacy and accusation, chose to leave rather than stay. Her absence left behind more than an empty chair at official events. It left a question hanging in the air. Could she ever return? And if she did, would anyone still see her as a queen, or only as the woman who ran when the crown became too heavy to bear? Camilla's decision to leave the country created a vacuum of authority and presence that the monarchy could not easily disguise. Unlike previous scandals that were managed behind closed doors, this one unfolded in full view of the public. Every news outlet carried the image of a queen departing on a private jet, and every headline emphasized the same point: she had fled. This single act altered the balance within the royal family, reshaping perceptions of power, loyalty, and legitimacy in ways that could not be undone. Inside the family, the absence was palpable. Charles, long known for leaning on Camilla as his closest confidant, was suddenly alone at a time when unity was desperately needed. Without her by his side, he appeared weakened, vulnerable, and almost diminished. Every photograph of him attending events without her told its own story, one of abandonment, loss, and isolation. The visual impact alone fueled speculation. If the Queen herself could not endure the weight of scrutiny, what did that mean for the future of the monarchy she had helped shape? Princess Anne, meanwhile, saw her position strengthened in ways no one could have predicted. Her defiance of Camilla's elevation from queen consort to simply queen had long been viewed as stubbornness, perhaps even jealousy. But with Camilla's flight, those objections suddenly seemed prescient, and was no longer the voice of dissent. She was the voice of reason, the one who had seen this outcome coming. Allies who once urged her to let go of her rivalry now admitted that her instincts had been correct all along. In family meetings, her words carried more weight, her presence more authority. To many, it felt as though Anne had stepped into a role of leadership that Camilla had forfeited. For the monarchy itself, the damage went beyond personalities. The scandal reopened the public's deep unease about the institution's transparency and accountability. If heirlooms connected to the late queen could be found outside their rightful place, what else might be hidden away? If a queen could flee under suspicion, what did that say about the stability of the crown? Trust, once fractured, is difficult to restore, and the Raymil House scandal fractured it in a way that echoed through every level of the monarchy's relationship with the people it represents. The press, eager to draw connections, dug deep into the past. They revived stories of Camilla's early reputation as someone who always took what she wanted. They revisited Diana's famous confession about 3 in this marriage, framing the heirloom scandal as yet another chapter in a lifetime of taking. The narrative was ruthless. First a relationship, then a crown, and now, allegedly, royal treasures. Even if no other items were ever discovered at Raymil House, the perception alone was enough to cement the image. For Camilla, perception had always been the greatest battlefield, and now she was losing it on every front. Public sentiment became increasingly unforgiving. Supporters of the monarchy, who had once softened their stance toward her, now turned critical. Social media amplified every negative angle, with old interviews, tabloid clippings, and even documentaries resurfacing. The contrast with Diana was inescapable. Diana had been portrayed as a victim of circumstance, someone wronged by forces beyond her control. Camilla, by contrast, was now seen as the architect of her own downfall. Where Diana's legacy inspired sympathy and affection, Camilla's evoked suspicion and disdain. Beyond public opinion, the scandal also strained the internal dynamics of the royal household. Staff who had once been loyal to Camilla found themselves adrift, uncertain of whether to defend her or distance themselves. Advisors tasked with protecting the monarchy's image struggled to find a strategy that could contain the damage. How could they frame her departure as anything other than an escape? How could they assure the public of the crown's stability when one of its most visible figures had vanished in the middle of a scandal? In private, Charles was said to be devastated. His love for Camilla had defined much of his adult life, shaping decisions that changed the course of history. But with her gone, he was left to face the harsh reality. The woman who had stood beside him through personal and public trials was now absent in his greatest moment of need. The symbolism was unbearable: a king without his queen, a man abandoned by the one person who was supposed to steady him. The impact was not just emotional, it was deeply political, weakening his image as a leader and casting shadows over his reign. The scandal also brought into sharper focus the concept of legacy. Elizabeth II's reign had been marked by duty and steadfastness, qualities that had earned her respect even among critics. Diana's legacy was marked by empathy and authenticity, qualities that kept her memory alive decades after her death. Camilla's legacy, however, now seemed destined to be defined by suspicion and retreat. In the great narrative of modern royalty, each figure was measured against the others, and in that comparison, Camilla's choices seemed catastrophic. Raymil House, once a symbol of privacy and peace, was transformed into a metaphor for secrecy and betrayal. Every mention of the estate carried with it the weight of the scandal, a reminder of what was found there and what it represented. It was no longer simply a home, it was the stage upon which a queen's reputation collapsed. And while no additional heirlooms were ever discovered, the damage had already been done. The idea that something tied to Elizabeth II had been hidden there was enough to taint the estate forever in the eyes of the public. Ultimately, Camilla's flight did not just damage her own standing, it weakened the monarchy as a whole. It exposed the fragility of its carefully managed image, revealed the fractures within its family structure, and reignited old wounds that many had hoped were long buried. The crown thrives on continuity, on the perception that it is unshakable, unyielding, and eternal. But with Camilla gone, that illusion cracked, leaving behind questions that no amount of tradition or ceremony could easily answer. Her absence forced the world to ask, had Camilla ever truly been accepted, or had she only been tolerated until the first real test came along? And if tolerance was all that had ever existed, what did that mean for the future of the monarchy now left to pick up the pieces of her departure? Camilla's sudden disappearance left the monarchy not just fractured, but exposed. What began with the discovery of a single heirloom at Raymil House spiraled into a crisis of trust, legacy, and belonging. Her flight raised the most pressing question of all. Had she ever truly deserved the crown she wore, or was her reign doomed from the very beginning? In her absence, the debate only grew louder, as her critics and defenders battled over how she would be remembered. For many, her legacy was inseparable from the spectre of Diana. The public never forgot Diana's honesty, her humanity, and her willingness to reveal the cracks in a gilded life. Every scandal involving Camilla seemed to resurrect Diana's memory, casting the contrast in sharper relief. Diana was remembered as the people's princess, beloved for her vulnerability. Camilla, by contrast, became the queen who fled, a woman accused of taking what was not hers, and unable to withstand the pressure when her integrity was called into question. The narrative was brutal, but it was also persistent, and it defined the public conversation. Charles's struggle without her became another focal point. For years, Camilla had been described as his rock, the woman who gave him stability and comfort. Her absence exposed him in a way no speech or appearance could disguise. Each event he attended alone seemed to tell the story of a king diminished, his greatest support ripped away at the worst possible time. And for the monarchy, this image was catastrophic. Strength and stability are its most valuable currencies, but here was a king portrayed as vulnerable, and a queen portrayed as untrustworthy. Together, those optics created an impression of weakness that no amount of ceremony could erase. Princess Anne's role grew more pronounced with each passing day. Her confrontation with Camilla had been scathing, but her insistence that Camilla would never be a true queen now carried an eerie weight. To many, it felt as though Anne had spoken the truth aloud before anyone else dared to. By standing firm, she emerged from the scandal not as a bitter rival but as a prophetic figure, someone who had seen the cracks in Camilla's rise long before the heirloom surfaced. Her influence inside the family swelled, and her reputation among the public solidified as one of strength and authenticity, qualities people had once associated most closely with her mother. Meanwhile, Raymil House itself stood as a haunting symbol of the controversy. It was no longer viewed as a quiet country home but as the place where Camilla's downfall began. Every detail about the heirloom's discovery was dissected, and the estate became shorthand for secrecy and suspicion. Even without additional revelations, the story was already cemented. The home where something precious, tied to Elizabeth II, was found without explanation, sparking a chain of events that ended with a queen's escape. The palace worked to downplay the scandal, but some damages cannot be undone. Once trust is broken, no carefully worded statement can repair it. People remembered Elizabeth's unwavering sense of duty and Diana's raw humanity, and when they compared Camilla's silence and flight, the judgment was swift and unforgiving. To many, she became the embodiment of everything the monarchy was not supposed to be: fragile, secretive, and unwilling to face the truth head-on. This left the monarchy at a crossroads. With Camilla gone, the institution had to reckon with whether she would ever return, and if she did, whether she could be received as anything other than the queen who fled. If she stayed away, her absence would serve as a constant reminder of instability. If she returned, she would carry the weight of scandal on her shoulders, with every appearance overshadowed by whispers of Raymil House. Either way, her role as queen had been permanently reshaped by her choice to run rather than remain. For the public, the scandal reinforced a painful truth: the crown may glitter, but it is fragile. The monarchy thrives on the illusion of permanence, of timelessness, of unshakable tradition. Yet here was proof that beneath the surface, it could be cracked by suspicion, rivalry, and legacy. The heirloom itself may have been just an object, but what it represented was far greater. It symbolized a legacy that Camilla was accused of mishandling, a history she was accused of disrespecting, and a duty she was accused of abandoning. In the end, the impact of her departure was twofold. On a personal level, it dismantled the decades of careful work she had invested in rebuilding her image, leaving her reputation in tatters. On a larger scale, it weakened the monarchy itself, stripping away the illusion of unity and opening old wounds that had never truly healed. It raised questions not only about Camilla but about the crown's ability to withstand the weight of modern scrutiny. And so, the queen who once stood beside her husband in triumph was now remembered in whispers and headlines as the queen who fled. Her story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that crowns may be won, but they must also be defended. In fleeing, she had not only abandoned her role but also surrendered the one thing she had fought for decades to achieve: acceptance. What remained was an empty throne at her side, a fractured family, and a legacy forever marked by the scandal of Raymil House. The scandal that unfolded at Raymil House and culminated in Camilla's sudden flight from the United Kingdom was more than just a moment of intrigue. It was a watershed event in the history of the monarchy. A single object, an heirloom tied to the late Queen Elizabeth II, set in motion a chain of accusations, confrontations, and consequences that exposed the fragility of both Camilla's position and the crown itself. What began as the discovery of something misplaced became the spark that reignited decades of suspicion, reopened old wounds, and revealed just how tenuous Camilla's acceptance had always been. At the heart of this crisis lies the question of legitimacy. Camilla's journey into the monarchy had always been fraught with difficulty. For years, she occupied the role of outsider, overshadowed by Diana's enduring legacy and judged harshly by the public. Through time, patience, and careful strategy, she managed to rehabilitate her image, transforming from the other woman into a queen consort standing beside Charles. It was, by many accounts, one of the greatest feats of image rehabilitation in modern royal history. And yet, as Raymil House showed, even decades of effort can collapse overnight when a single narrative confirms the doubts people had quietly held all along. The heirloom was more than just an object, it was a symbol. Because it was tied to Elizabeth II, it carried the full weight of reverence for a monarch who defined an era. To discover something belonging to her in Camilla's private estate raised unanswerable questions. Was it stolen, misplaced, or quietly moved? No explanation could undo the perception that Camilla had crossed a sacred boundary. Elizabeth's name was synonymous with duty, constancy, and trust. Camilla, already vulnerable to accusations of opportunism, now stood accused, directly or indirectly, of mishandling that legacy. Princess Anne's confrontation brought this symbolism into sharp relief. Her words, accusing Camilla of theft and declaring that she would never be a true queen, cut through decades of polite silence and gave voice to what many within the family, and certainly much of the public, had long thought. This was not merely a feud between two women, it was a clash between two visions of the monarchy, and represented duty, hard work, and continuity. Camilla, rightly or wrongly, was cast as the figure who had taken what was not hers. In Anne's accusation, the rivalry that began with Andrew Parker Bowles and deepened during Charles's affair with Camilla reached its dramatic peak. And the timing, so soon after Elizabeth's death, so soon after Charles's decision to elevate Camilla's title, made it all the more devastating. The decision to flee compounded the damage. Whatever her reasons, fear, shame, exhaustion, or a strategic retreat, the optics could not be ignored. A queen leaving her country under suspicion was unprecedented. It reinforced the narrative that when tested, Camilla's reign could not withstand the weight of scrutiny. Compare this to Elizabeth II, who faced countless crises yet remained steadfast, or Diana, who endured public heartbreak yet spoke openly and won admiration for her honesty. Against these legacies, Camilla's silence and absence looked like weakness. She was not seen standing tall in defense of her crown. She was seen boarding a private jet. Her departure also shifted the balance within the royal household. Charles was left exposed, a king without his queen. For years, Camilla had been described as his anchor, the one who steadied him in moments of difficulty. Without her, he appeared vulnerable, diminished, and uncertain. The monarchy thrives on images, and these images, Charles alone, Camilla gone, were catastrophic. They suggested instability at the very top, and instability in monarchy is poison. And, conversely, emerged stronger. Her long-standing objections to Camilla's role were vindicated, her warnings suddenly validated. She became the voice of reason in a family rocked by scandal. To the public, she appeared as the embodiment of strength, echoing her mother's legacy of resilience. While Camilla's absence weakened Charles, it strengthened Anne, altering the family's internal dynamics in ways that may prove lasting. But perhaps the most profound consequence was the reopening of Diana's story. For years, the monarchy had sought to move past the tragedies of the 1990s to present a united and modernized front. Yet the scandal brought Diana's ghost back to the forefront of public memory. Old footage was replayed, her words about 3 in this marriage revisited, and her pain remembered. In contrast, Camilla's reputation suffered anew. Where Diana was remembered with empathy, Camilla was cast in suspicion. It was as though time had folded in on itself, and the unresolved tensions of the past returned to haunt the present. Raymil House itself became a metaphor for secrecy and betrayal. No longer a private sanctuary, it was now synonymous with scandal. Just as Balmoral was forever linked with Elizabeth's quiet dignity and Kensington Palace with Diana's openness, Raymil House became indelibly tied to the moment Camilla's reign unraveled. The estate stood as a reminder that in monarchy, there are no true walls of privacy. Every corner of personal life can, at any moment, become part of public history. What does this mean for Camilla's legacy? In truth, it may already be sealed. Even if she were to return, the perception of flight will always follow her. In monarchy, symbols matter more than explanations. And the enduring image of her reign will be that of departure, a queen choosing escape over endurance. For decades, she had fought to be accepted, to be seen not as a villain but as a partner and a queen. And yet, in one scandal, that acceptance was shattered, leaving her remembered not for her efforts to rehabilitate her image, but for the moment she abandoned the throne. The impact on the monarchy itself is equally profound. Scandals are not new, but they are cumulative. Each one chips away at the perception of stability, each one weakens the bond of trust between the crown and the people. The Raymil House scandal was not just about Camilla, it was about the monarchy's ability to project strength and continuity. If a queen can flee, what does that say about the permanence of the institution itself? If a royal heirloom can surface outside its rightful place, what does that say about the guardianship of history? These questions linger, and they do not easily fade. In the final measure, the scandal revealed something the palace has long tried to deny, that acceptance cannot be manufactured and legitimacy cannot be forced. Camilla's reign was built on carefully curated appearances, charitable endeavors, and palace strategy. But beneath it all, doubt remained. The heirloom scandal did not create that doubt, it simply confirmed it. And in confirming it, it destroyed the delicate balance that had allowed her to stand as queen. Her story, then, becomes a cautionary tale within the long saga of the monarchy. It is a reminder that crowns are not only symbols of power but burdens of expectation, that legitimacy is not conferred by titles alone but by the ability to embody the values a nation expects of its monarchs. Elizabeth did this with duty, Diana with honesty. Camilla, when faced with a test, chose departure. And that choice may define her forever. The queen who once fought so hard to stand beside her husband now finds her reign remembered not for triumph, but for flight. In the end, she did not just leave behind her estate or her crown, she left behind the fragile trust she had spent decades trying to build. The scandal at Raymil House will be remembered not for the object that was discovered, but for what it revealed, that beneath the crowns, the palaces, and the centuries of tradition, even queens can falter, even legacies can collapse, and even the mightiest image can shatter with a single step onto a waiting jet.